Hello, BookTube. It's day 3 of Nonfiction November. That's an event hosted and organized by Gemma at Nonfic Books and Olive at A Book Olive, in which for the month of November they encourage you to read more nonfiction. Uh, to read some if you read none, and to read more if you read some. It's a common refrain that I see in lots and lots of readers, especially now that I've joined BookTube. People constantly saying they wish they read more nonfiction, but either they don't know where to start or they feel a little off-put by the nature of it. I've gone over before, I've mentioned before on this channel that part of that feeling of being off-put by the nature of nonfiction is an illusion. Because all narrative is world building. And in an average giant fantasy novel in Patrick Rothfuss, you are asked to bring yourself up to speed on a whole lot of exposition, just the same as you would be on a book about the French Revolution. It's exactly the same process, the same muscles, and the same amount of exposition that you have to just scramble to gather. The reason it feels different with nonfiction is because you know in the back of your mind that the exposition in nonfiction has been studied and written about by experts forever. And that shouldn't be in your mind at all. A writer who's doing a good job, fiction or nonfiction, will have your narrative needs in mind and will keep you up to speed. And if they don't do that, if you're reading a work of nonfiction about the Salem witch trials, and the author goes off for 10 paragraphs about something without grounding it in anything, well, then you're reading a bad author. It's not you, it's them. But I wanted to make another recommendation today for Nonfiction November. It's the third in my triptych of ancient historians. We started with Herodotus, the father of the idea of writing history, and we moved on to Livy, the great Roman historian Livy, one of my all-time favorites. And when I was talking about Livy, I had to talk about his style, his rhetorical style. There's no way to get around it. And part of it is the exposition that we're talking about. A good introduction to an English language translation of Livy will bring this up, will ground you in it. And that is the fundamental difference between Latin and English. The main hurdle that a translator has to cross in translating Latin to English is that it has to do with word order. English is a very word order freighted language. It's got some unwritten rules that tend to shape its patterns. Like, for instance, if you have a red fox, the adjective red is not going to appear anywhere else in the sentence except right next to fox. and the same time, the same way, it can cause confusion if you don't do that. Like if you say, in English, if you say, my mother visited my father who is sick, you're going to understand that the father is sick. But a Roman audience wouldn't necessarily understand that. A Roman audience would see mother, father, sick, just sort of floating around, and the word ending would determine where it attaches to, not the word's place in the sentence. And that's a difference in Latin, and because it's a difference in Latin, because it's a linguistic difference, nothing more, nothing less, nothing intimidating, nothing strange, because it's a linguistic difference, writers could make virtuoso performance art out of it. Writers can make virtuoso performance art out of anything if you give them half a chance. That's why they're such annoying company. Livy did that very much, and if you haven't studied Latin, it might take you a minute to see the kind of artistry that you could do with that, where the adjective, where you've got nouns and an adjective is floating around and the reader is kind of in suspense as to where you're going to attach it at the very end. It can add a sting, a zinger, to a very long Latin sentence. Very long. And Livy takes full advantage of that. He's an amazing artist when it comes to that. And the historian I want to talk about today is not. The historian I want to talk about today is Tacitus, another one of my favorites, a Roman historian from the 1st century AD, who was everything in his life. He like Livy, he came from the provinces. He wasn't from the city. And like Livy, he wasn't from a a noble house or anything like that. He did have money, and he pursued a public career. He unlike Livy lived for his books. Tacitus lived for writing too, but he pursued a public career. He was a senator. He was consul, a head of the Senate. He was a kind of civilian side general. He saw action with the legions, and a whole bunch of other offices too. Offices that Roman historians or Roman history fans will know them. He was all over the map politically, but he also wrote a lot, and he wrote more as he got older. He started out in Rome young. There's a picture I took of him on his way to the Senate, and yeah, there we go. He started out young, and he got his main advancement under the Flavian emperors. It was a trio of brutes, absolute brutes. There was Vespasian, who was as wide as he was tall, and took the empire out of chaos. There was a year where rival generals and politicians were fighting for control of the empire after the death of Nero, and no one knew where the dust was going to settle, and Vespasian won. He wasn't elected. There was no public acclaim. There was no great mandate. He just won. He was the winner. And he ruled, and then the rule passed to his sons. He had a pretty son named Titus, who was competent and fairly good, except incredibly vain. And then he had an evil son named Domitian, and Domitian ruled after Titus, took the control of the empire from Titus, saw Titus off to the underworld, and then ruled himself. And most of Tacitus's public career, most of his political advancements came under Domitian. And Domitian was nuts. He was a full-blown insane tyrant. And Tacitus couldn't write about that, obviously, since if he did, and he gave a reading, the next morning the Praetorian Guard would be at his door and he would be dead. So instead, he wrote about the past. He wrote mostly about the Roman past. He wrote about earlier emperors, Caligula, Nero, Tiberius. And his portrait of Tiberius is that of a megalomaniac tyrant, of an unpredictable, touchy tyrant. And it's gripping reading. It's tremendously good. I've always said, and I try to give a light warning to people who are starting Tacitus for the first time, that it's not completely fair. It was never meant to be fair. Tacitus is taking out a lot of his shame and his anger at Domitian, and at owing his career to Domitian, on Tiberius, who wasn't as bad as Tacitus portrays him to be. And unbeknownst to Tacitus, he sort of has the final word. History has sort of relies on him for its portrait of Tiberius, and that's unfortunate. But the reason I wanted to bring up Livy's rhetorical style when writing Latin, is because Tacitus largely dispenses with it in favor of a much more direct style. There's almost none of that floating around, that where you have a kernel of a noun and then you have these quantum waves lapping out from it of adjectives and adjectival phrases, all that stuff that's so glorious in Livy. Tacitus doesn't do it. Instead, he zeroes in, he chips away at the language to come up with the perfect phrase, but just a phrase, and right near where it's talking about. It's in very many ways, it looks forward to modern expressions of language, to modern ways of writing. In a lot of ways it does. It's Tacitus is, if you're reading forward in time in ancient history, he's the first gust of modern air. He's the first cool blast of the way we think and talk now, which is why I think he's been so revered by stylists, by quote miners, and also by politicians. Everybody loves Tacitus. The founding fathers of America, for instance, were steeped in his work. And unlike Livy wanted to deal with mytho-history. He wanted to talk about the great people of the past and the emblematic things they did. Tacitus is much more concerned with people, actual people, and their mind frames, their psychologies. And his books, well, he wrote a lot of books. He wrote for instance, a book, Germania. He wrote a book about tribal Germany that still casts a long shadow today. And he wrote a short biography of his father-in-law that's actually remarkable reading. But his major works are the Annals and the Histories, which is really an artificial distinction. He, like Livy, he wrote a long work of Roman history, and we have only later broken it up. And large chunks of it are missing, and some chunks of it only come to us by the slimmest of margins, literally the slimmest of margins, where one copy existed in some monastery somewhere, and one spring the flood tide came this high and the book was on this shelf. All the books on these shelves below were lost. And their one copy of Tacitus, that unbeknownst to anybody was the only copy of Tacitus anywhere in the world, was on this shelf, and the flood tide just didn't get that far. That's all. Random chance. No worms, no mice, no flood tide, so we have that. Otherwise, we would only have Tacitus' name. And maybe the Agricola, maybe the book about his father-in-law, which would mean that we would be considering him a minor Roman historian instead of one of the greatest Roman historians of them all. It's just a happenstance of history that fortunately we're less vulnerable to now than we ever have been, because of electronics, because of the cloud, because the electronics are metal, and technology exists to extract content from them in a way that, you know, if you have a vellum book and it's doused in flood water for a whole spring, nothing can save it. There's nothing that can retrieve it. The molecules disband into the water. There's no way you can get them back. Anyway, talk about that some other time. And it's the main work is Tacitus's histories, and I can't recommend them strongly enough. He is, you can probably guess from what I've been saying, his differences with Livy, he's a fairly easy author to translate. I know that sounds deceptive. Really, the glory of a modern English version of Tacitus will be in the notes. His Latin, if you've got a complete handle on Latin, it's not as challenging by far, because it's doing the things it's doing are things that English later became concerned with doing, and it's not, his Latin isn't trying to do anything that English doesn't try to do. So it's a much more one-to-one fit, and you will recognize him. That's the curious thing about Tacitus. If you try him, if you pick, the point I'm trying to make is that any English language translation that you find in the bookstores or the library will do just fine. And the thing about reading him, the unnerving, wonderful thing about reading him, is that you will recognize him. You will feel his voice in a way that you don't feel Livy's. You'll feel like you're reading William Safire or P.J. O'Rourke or some political commentator today, for the snap of the phrases, for the anger, for the misanthropy. You'll feel in the presence of a contemporary sensibility, and that's thrilling. To know there were such men, even 2,000 years ago, watching these emperors, spending time with them. A man who put his arm around the shoulder of a drunken Caligula wrote this book that you get to read. So that's my Nonfiction November recommendation for today. And for those of you who have been emailing me with frowny faces and maybe even some less presentable emoji, no, I do not plan on talking about Roman historians the whole time. I did Herodotus, Livy, and now Tacitus, and so that's a triptych of historians. I will shift gears tomorrow to something else. Yeah, there's a bunch of wimps. But I'll see you soon, Book 2. Thank you.